Welcome everyone to the SF Bay Area School Counselors and Education Professionals Meetup Group. I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr. James Bylund, in his talk, which is called What Everyone Should Be Talking About But Isn't, the Autonomic Nervous System, Polyvagal Theory, and Student Behavior. Our meetup group is, of course, sponsored by CounselHero. CounselHero is trying to change our school and college counseling as we know it by building a complete end-to-end system that automates many of the tasks counselors are asked to do in schools. This will free up counselors to spend more time with their students and impact their lives. One counselor in a school can have as many as 1,000 cases of students, but CounselHero makes it possible to serve all of these with a combination of AI and social emotional learning tests. So go check it out at CounselHero.com. Owner and director of the Bylund Clinic, Dr. James Bylund specializes in neuroeducational services. He is also the co-founder of techhealthy.org, a nonprofit organization working to protect people from risks associated with the overuse and misuse of technology. He received a master's in education in EDS in school psychology from San Diego State University, and Bylund went on to get his doctorate in educational psychology from Alliant International University. For his private practice, Bylund has worked as a SELPA program specialist, school psychologist, and as the district director of student support services. We're very excited to have him, and please now give your full attention to Dr. James Bylund.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Xavier. Really appreciate the introduction. Yeah, the title I was just dosing right now, right? So what everybody should be talking about is definitely geared towards schools, right? I think the idea, or at least my thinking, was that it's what everybody in schools should be talking about. And of course, that's the autonomic nervous system, polyvagal theory, and how that applies to student engagement. Now, there's just a little bit about myself here, and Xavier covered quite a bit of it. But the one thing that's not on here that really relates to what we're talking about today is the fact that, I went through 7 years of graduate school, and I don't remember anybody saying anything about the autonomic nervous system. I even did postdoctorate work in neuropsychology, and I don't really remember anyone saying it there either. Not that they didn't, but I don't remember it, so it couldn't have been too big of a part. What I do remember is a lot of time in graduate school talking about behavior and behavior modification and antecedents or triggers to behavior and how behavior is reinforced or kind of behavioral terms sort of like punished or what's done to sort of lessen the likelihood of it happening again. And then I went into the field of school psychology, and it was just more of the same. Like we were, my district, behavior intervention case managers, and that's part of what a school psychologist did was assess behavior, and all we were ever doing was looking at sort of what's the triggering event and what's the consequence. And then what new behavior do we want to teach the student? And I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure how effective it all was. Maybe I was just a bad behavior intervention case manager, but it seemed like we did a lot of stuff and filled out a lot of paperwork, and not a whole lot happened with it, including not a whole lot, for the kids that, we were trying to help. And it probably wasn't for a decade after I even finished graduate school before I even came across anything about the autonomic nervous system and polyvagal theory, which frankly has, really taken hold in the mental health field. And yet I don't hear anybody in schools talking about it. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe I'm just not part of the conversation, or maybe we just need to start the conversation. And so, trying to do that, I guess, right? So what's the problem, right? Behaviorism used to reign in psychology. It was the thing to do up until the 1960s. And it's continued to some degree, right? I mean, behaviorism still has its place in the field of psychology. But in the 1960s, I think a lot of people in the field kind of woke up and thought, hey, there's a lot more to the human experience other than a triggering event and what either reinforces the behavior or punishes the behavior, that all of us are far more than sort of a series of input and output functions over time. The human experience is just far more complex than that. And we saw the rise of humanistic psychology and Carl Rogers and the importance of relationship and development and healing and change. and cognitive psychology, right? And those have since branched out even further, into other fields, even into embodied cognition, and even beyond the mind and the brain, and what role does the body play in all of this has really even sort of emerged in the past few years. And yet schools are largely running sort of under this paradigm of behaviorism and behavior modification, and you see it at all levels, right? I mean, the school-wide disciplinary policies, right, are punishments for behaviors that we don't want to see, or classroom level systems with kids clipping up and clipping down, right, every time we want to reward a behavior or punish a behavior. And for those of you who work in special education, then you're also familiar with functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans, which are really sort of the pinnacle of behaviorism, right? We're trying to figure out what the problem behavior is, what we want them to do instead, and then modifying, the antecedents, what happens before the behavior, and the consequences, what happens after, to try to shape or change the behavior, right? And so because it has such a dominant role in what we do in schools, I think it's a reasonable question, right, to stop and ask, how is all that working out for us or for our kids, right? And you could arguably say it's not working real well. The National Center for Educational Statistics estimates somewhere around 3.5 million kids are suspended from school every year. The preschooler one, I don't know, man. I still have a hard time believing that one. But it's crazy, right? 250 preschoolers are suspended or expelled from school every single day. That's insane. And the problem isn't equally distributed, right? We are suspending and expelling Black and brown children at far higher rates, right? Black kids are 3.8 times more likely to get suspended from school than white kids. There's a problem there, right? And the same thing is true for our kids with disabilities. They're twice as likely to get suspended as well, too. And it's not just sort of these externalizing behaviors, right? Not these just behaviors that lead to disciplinary action, but we have a mental health epidemic amongst youth these days, right? And these statistics don't even carry us up to 2021, right? I mean, you can imagine, these are trends that have been going on for decades, right? And so we can imagine that the numbers are even worse now. But the number of kids that were teenagers that were reporting feeling depressed over in the 10-year span between 2007 and 2017 rose 59%, right? 29% of kids in that same study were saying that they felt tense or nervous either every day or almost every day, right? I mean, that would suggest that we may have as many as 30% of teens coming to school with some form of an anxiety or anxiety disorder. And of course, the most frightening one of all is the number of kids, the increasing number of kids who are taking their own lives, right? And this was a study of 10 to 14-year-olds, right? I mean, my God, I've got an almost 10-year-old. That's insane. I can't even wrap my mind around that. But the fact that we're seeing a doubling in a 7-year span from 2007 to 2014 in youth suicide is absolutely crazy. Now, fortunately, I would say in the past few years, at least, it seems, just sort of a casual observer of all of these things, that there has been a little bit more attention paid in schools to things beyond just behavior, right? I feel like there's definitely like a movement in sort of trauma-informed practices in schools. I see that, and saying, hey, this isn't just about rewarding and punishing behaviors. There's definitely like a relational component to this, right? There's things going on inside kids besides what we're observing on the outside, right? They have a history. They've got, perhaps some big T or small t sorts of traumas over the course of their lives, and they have thoughts that we don't observe, right? And they have feelings that we can't see, and they have sense perceptions and internal bodily experiences that we're not observing, all of which influence their engagement and behavior in school. And I think part of that, is sort of this 25 years later, the sort of like recognition in education. Frankly, this sat largely dormant for 20 years was the ACE study, right? When we looked at the Felides and Kaiser and Center for Disease Control, looked at 17,000 adults, right? And and looked at the number of people who experience these sort of adverse childhood experiences and the impact that they had, right? Not just on our social and emotional well-being and our behavior, but cognitive abilities, relationship status, employment status, difficulties with the, coming into conflict with the law, even health, right? We spend a lot of time, I think, at least here in California, right? You just don't see people smoking because we know smoking kills you, right? It ends your life early. Well, guess what ends your life earlier than smoking, right? Stress. It shortens your life, and so, the ACE study was a big part of our understanding of that. And so I think there is sort of a slow movement in sort of this understanding in schools, and in part probably due to, the sort of ACE findings kind of coming forth and being presented more, within an educational setting. But these adverse childhood experiences, I mean, there are things like, physical abuse and sexual abuse, which a shocking number of people have experienced, right? But there are other things, right? There are things like, my parents are separated, or I have somebody in my family that has a mental health issue. My parents, drink or use other drugs in excess. Even things, like I don't feel loved, right? Or I don't feel important, are, factors that were looked at, in the ACE study. And not only do a lot of people experience these, but most people experience more than one. And there's a cumulative effect. So the more of them that we experience, the higher risk we're at for all sorts of things, right? Whether there are difficulties in school, difficulties in employment and relationships, mental health issues, or even physical health problems. And in terms of kids, a lot of our kids who are getting trouble in school are kids who have experienced significant adverse childhood experiences. I'm gonna, again, I don't know who all is here, right, or what sort of your role is in schools. I will say, and it's kind of just sort of my aside here for a second. In schools, at least in special education, there's been a sort of long-held belief that when kids feel anxious or depressed, they're sort of, could be like educationally, emotionally disturbed. But if they have any kind of behavior problem or acting out, they're like socially maladjusted, as if that isn't due to some sort of underlying psychological distress. Kids manifest their stress differently than adults do. And these kids who are getting in trouble in school and are ending up being detained are kids that have significant trauma histories and significant ACE histories. And 50% of kids that have ACE scores of 4 higher, so 4 more of these adverse childhood experiences, are experiencing problems in school, right? Problems with learning or problems with behavior. 90% of kids in juvenile detention facilities, have histories of trauma. Half of them have experienced 6 or more by the time that they're arrested. And a picture sort of covering it up here, but I think the mean exposure for juvenile people in juvenile detention is more than 14 traumatic events. I double check that. 14.6. Close. And so a lot of these behaviors that we're seeing, right, these acting out behaviors and even violent behavior, drug abuse, these really are ways of them coping with the internal distress that they don't understand or don't know how to deal with, right? Whether they're coping with those feelings by using drugs, or their physiology is out of control and in a state of fight or flight, and they're acting out, they're irritable and angry and acting out with physical violence or verbal aggression. There's an underlying reason for that, right? It's not it's not just bad behavior, and we need to recognize that for what it is. Now, fortunately, neuroscience has come a long, long way, in the past few decades, and really helps us to understand, what's going on below the behavior, right? Not just looking at triggering events and behaviors and the consequences of those behaviors, but really sort of understanding, how our thoughts and emotions and physical sensations, impact behavior as well. And like I said, I didn't hear any of this stuff in graduate school. Maybe I just went to the wrong graduate school. But my guess is that a lot of people haven't heard much about this yet in the field of education, right? And Polyvagal Theory, which helps us to understand the role and function of the autonomic nervous system, gives us an alternative. And that alternative understanding can help us shift how we address these behaviors in schools and work with kids and promote behaviors that are more conducive to learning. All right. So if you're looking at this, you're like, what the heck? Don't worry about it. And Lord, don't try to take a note. Just trying to explain something here real quick, right? So I don't have a pointer, do I? Okay, so a lot of times when we think about our brain, right, our central nervous system, we're really just kind of thinking about that, 3.5 pounds that's sort of resting inside of our skull, right? But there's more to it than that. Even our central nervous system includes our spinal cord. But I think what we're appreciating is this sort of, what we used to have, this sort of dualistic thinking between our mind and our body as these sort of like two separate entities, or even our brain and our body as being separate from one another. They're not, right? It's one integrated nervous system, right? And so not only do we have our central nervous system, we also have our peripheral nervous system, which connects our brains and our bodies. Now, our peripheral nervous system, there's a few different things, right? There's our somatic nervous system, which allows us to plan and execute sort of volitional movements, right? Like, oh God, I'm thirsty, right? Let me go grab my water, and I can do that intentionally. Our autonomic nervous system works kind of below the radar, right? It does those things that we don't have to think about. So, our heart beats. I don't have to tell my heart to beat, thank God. I don't have to tell myself to breathe, right? I don't have to tell myself to digest food. My body just kind of does all that stuff on its own. And that's because of our autonomic nervous system. Now, Stephen Porges, who we'll talk about in a minute with polyvagal theory, kind of teases part a little bit further. But sort of the basics here is we've got our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system, right? And our sympathetic nervous system, when you think about the term fight or flight, right? Like we experience or perceive some danger in our environment, and we've got to respond really quickly, right? I remember my oldest son and his first birthday. We were at a barbecue at his aunt's house, right? And he's on the Acapulco section of the pool. He's kind of standing there next to his great aunt and great uncle, who were having a wonderful conversation with each other. Not doing a wonderful job of watching my son. And he just like tips over, right? He's like 1 year old, just sort of drops into the water. And I don't remember the event. People told me about it later. I set down my beer, I put my chip down, and I like hurdled over like 12 people, and I got to the pool and picked them up and like walked them inside. That was my sympathetic nervous system, right? It just kicked into gear, right? Like it perceived some danger in the environment and it responded, right? And we need that. That's super important, right? If I'm walking across the street and I see a car that doesn't look like it's going to stop at the red light, I need to get the heck out of the way, right? So it serves a really important function. But that's kind of like our fight or flight response. When we're in fight or flight, we're not really engaged socially, right? Our mental faculties aren't online, right? Because if I had to stop and think about what I needed to do, I wouldn't be able to respond quickly enough, right? So, when we're in that state, we're not thinking really clearly, we're not engaging with others, we're sort of either sort of in this fighting state or with, running away, right? So in either case, we're not engaging much there. But when we're in a parasympathetic state, we're able to relax. We're able to engage socially. We're able to make eye contact and pick up on sort of subtle cues and other people's voice prosody and tone and facial expressions, and sort of pick up on all those cues of safety. My higher level cognitive abilities are online. All those executive skills that I need to sort of evaluate a situation and plan and organize my behaviors. And physiologically, my body's relaxed, right? My heartbeat slows down, my breath rate slows down. I'm able to digest food. If you think about when you're really nervous and your stomach kind of hurts, or you got butterflies in your stomach, so your digestion's not working correctly. And so parasympathetic, they might describe as sort of like rest and digest, right? But there's other ways to think about this, right? So sympathetic is sort of like this mobilized state, right? I'm in a state of mobilization. I'm ready to act, right? Whether that's fight or flee, right? Where parasympathetic is more sort of immobilized, right? I'm sort of like able to sit back and relax and be in more of a calm state. The sympathetic nervous system is a state of protection, right? I'm protecting myself or those around me. The parasympathetic is a state of connection, right? So that's another way to sort of think about it. Or if you did think about an analogy of a car, right? A sympathetic nervous system is the gas. You know, it punches and accelerates and then we're off. The parasympathetic is more of the brake, right? It kind of slows us down a little bit. Now here's just sort of another sort of diagram of it, right? So, you know, we've got in pink our central nervous system and in blue our peripheral nervous system connecting our brain and our body. And I think what's really fascinating now too is that we're learning how much of a role our body actually plays. George Lakoff has a book, Philosophy in the Flesh, where they estimate somewhere between 90 or 95% of processing occurs outside of our conscious awareness. And a lot of it is occurring in our body, and more signals are actually transmitted from our body to our brain than from our brain to our body, which is really sort of a, for somebody who spent their whole life sort of studying and measuring higher level cognitive abilities, it was very humbling, right, to, you know, to learn that fact. And a lot of emerging research is suggesting now that a lot of what our brain is doing is really just observing. That a lot of the things that we think we're in control of are actually activated before we even are aware of it, right? And our brain observes it and thinks it was responsible. Right? So this connection between our brain and our body is an important one to understand. And now this is Stephen Porges, right? So this is the dude I ran across like 10 years after graduate school, not in person, right? Just kind of, you know, online or something. I don't even know where I heard it. But it turns out, as brilliant as this dude is, he's like one half of like the neuroscience power couple. His wife, who I imagine most people don't know who she is, but they know what she has done. Her name's Sue Carter, and she's actually the one that's largely responsible for our understanding of the neurochemical oxytocin, which is the bonding chemical, right? The one that's responsible in large part for attachment. And the one that why, if you have a child, the first thing they ensure that happens is that there's skin-to-skin contact between the baby and the mother because of the release of oxytocin and the bond that occurs, right? And so really sort of fascinating, right, that these two kind of found each other. But Stephen Porges is the one that proposed polyvagal theory. And the reason why this is so important for the work that we're doing in schools is because it helps to explain, I think it helps to explain just about every challenge that we're observing young people having, right, in schools. Frankly, he's got three different states that go a long way in explaining just about every mental health disorder that there is. But it helps us to understand what's going on with kids when they're disengaged. And as we're going to talk about, it kind of provides a framework for understanding what we can do to help get kids back engaged by working with our autonomic nervous system, right? Not just by, you know, rewarding or punishing behaviors, but how do we accurately assess and work with a child's autonomic state in order to get them into a place where their their behavior is regulated and they're engaged in learning. So what Dr. Porges found is that the autonomic nervous system actually plays a really key role in detecting signals of safety and threat in our environment. So I alluded to that a little bit, right, with the fight or flight response with the autonomic nervous system, or in some of the description of the parasympathetic nervous system. But one of its functions that it does, again, outside of our conscious awareness, just constantly working in the background, and we'll talk about this again in just a moment with this concept called neuroception. Our autonomic nervous system is actually just detecting signals of safety and threat in our environment all the time. Now, it might be detecting those really accurately, and it might be detecting those really inaccurately, right? Which is a sign of impaired autonomic nervous system functioning. Now, what he says, there's actually three states, right? The parasympathetic nervous system, there's actually two branches to it. There's sort of what he called the ventral vagal, which is the newer part of the parasympathetic nervous system evolutionarily, right? And then the dorsal vagal, which is an older part of the parasympathetic nervous system, a part that we actually share with like reptiles and fish and things like that. And so there's actually these three different sort of autonomic nervous system states, right? There's this state of social engagement, where higher level cognitive faculties are online. We're able to reason, solve problems. Those executive skills are online. We can regulate our attention. Memory is online, right? So we're able to retain information and accurately recall it. And then there's two other states. One of them being that sympathetic fight or flight, and then the other one being activation of our old vagus, which is a state of shutdown. And so we're going to talk about those a little bit here. But his model helps us to really sort of understand what's going on with individuals across these different states. And I think really super important for us as educators and anybody working with young people, and it applies to adults too, right? This isn't limited to kids. But I think really sort of important for all of us to have some working knowledge of. And so I'll talk about these here, fairly briefly, and we are going to sort of jump into some of the assessment and intervention stuff here in just a moment. This image here came from a woman, Deb Dana, who nobody has done more to translate Steve Porges' work into daily life than Deb Dana. So if this is something that you find some interest in, I would look into her. Now, all of her work, she's an LCSW, so all of her work, she's a therapist, right? So all of her work's geared towards adult populations and working in therapy, but she's done an absolute brilliant job of taking all this work that Stephen Porges does in a lab, right? And translate it into everyday stuff. So sort of here's this diagram here of the three different autonomic states, but it's at the top, we have social engagement, and that's for a human being, that's our default mode, right? Minus significant history of trauma or some other developmental disability or something else that might have sort of gotten in the way of that. But that's our default mode for a fully developed human being, right? We are social creatures, right? We are not the fastest animal on the planet, right? We are not the strongest animal on the planet. What has allowed us to become the dominant species is our ability to sort of organize complex social networks, right? It allows for us to develop the brain that we have, right? Our kids take, now we understand 25, 6, 7, 8 years to fully develop their brain, right? Which means that they need, a family and social structure around them to allow for all that time, for their brain to develop. And frankly, arguably that large prefrontal cortex is what is there to allow us to organize these complex, social networks, right? But that's our default mode, right? And it helps our survival, right? Because we're able to plan and organize and work in groups. We're not only able to survive but thrive, and again, I'm imagining right now all these different arguments against what I'm about to say, but sort of be this dominant species on the planet, right? Now, when the social engagement system doesn't work, then we drop into states of defense, right? That's when we get into our fight or flight response, right? When there's such an emergency that my life is in immediate danger, or the life of somebody I love is in immediate danger, I automatically downshift into these states of defense, right? To this protective state. My body is interested in keeping me alive, right? It does that. I don't have to think about that. It wants me alive. It wants my children alive, right? So that I can spread my genes to the next generation, right? And so it does these things automatically without me thinking about it. And there are times when states of defense aren't sufficient, and we go into these states of complete shutdown. Now, some reptiles do this. This is their primary mode of defense, right? Their heartbeat slows down to the point at which they appear dead. They even enter sort of these states of rigor mortis, right? But they're not. They're just in this complete shutdown. But humans do this too. In fact, sadly, right? Young infants, right? If they're not held and cared for, their heart rate will slow down. It's called bradycardia. Will actually slow down to the point at which they will die. because their nervous system detects that they won't be cared for, that they don't have what they need in order to survive. And part of what they need is to be cared for by a loving adult, right? And so this is that old branch of the vagus nerve, right? The part that sort of allows our heart rate and breath rate to slow down and relax, that we can socially engage. Well, if we do that too much, right, we go too far, it becomes dangerous. Now, for survivors of trauma, this would account for dissociation, and for other people who just sort of have withdrawn from the world and feel depressed, they're really sort of in this dorsal vagal state, right? The state of shutdown. Now, before we sort of jump into the intervention stuff here, because it's really super important for the interventions to understand them, are these sort of 3 organizing principles around the autonomic nervous system through a polyvagal lens. One is there's a sort of autonomic hierarchy. This means over time, like over the course of like evolution of species, right? We see this movement from sort of dorsal vagal shutdown, right, to sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, to the sort of ventral vagal social engagement system, right? And so we see that over time in species. We see that within the course of an individual's life and an individual's development, right, as these skills develop. But it also means that, again, we sort of move through them in a certain progression, right? So we can, we'll move from, states of social engagement to defense to shutdown. Now, again, it's not to say I want to be real clear here. It's not that one is good and the other is bad. They're not. They're all good and they're all essential and necessary for survival, right? What's key, though, is that they're activated when they're needed, and we can flexibly move between these states in order to serve us, right? So we want to activate a state of defense when I need to save my 1-year-old from drowning, right? But I also need to quickly shift out of that, and get into a state where now I can comfort him and make sure that he's okay, and engage socially and connect with my wife and make sure that everything's okay, right? And so I need to be able to move between these states flexibly. And the problem is when we lose that flexibility, when we get stuck into these states and struggle to shift out of them, right? Now, the 2 key pieces here as far as some of our interventions, assessments and interventions, are these concepts of neuroception and co-regulation. Now, neuroception, I touched on this. This is that idea that our nervous system is constantly detecting the environment for signals of safety or threat. It's going on all the time, right? So I'm talking to you right now, and I don't have to look up, but if I hear the door open to my lobby, I'm gonna look up, right? Because I'm on alert, even though I'm not aware of it, right? Now, Dr. Porges talked about when we have like strong neuroception and faulty neuroception. So strong neuroceptions mean we're able to accurately detect signals of safety and threat in our environment. Faulty neuroception means we can't, right? Because we're stuck in either the state of defense or state of shutdown. And in those states, we're not picking up on all the cues that would let us know that the environment is safe, right? So a neutral facial expression suddenly appears dangerous, right? A neutral tone of voice sounds threatening, right? A simple request or demand of somebody to do something suddenly seems like a threat, right? And I'm hoping as I'm saying that you can picture some of the young people that you work with where you're like, dude, what's up, man? Like, that was not easy, man. I'm just trying to help you out here. Because they're in this state, right? And their neuroceptive capacity is not working accurately, right? And we'll talk about some of the physiological signs of that in a minute, and I think it helps explain why. And the other idea here is co-regulation. We don't develop our self-regulatory capacity on our own. That ability, like all other human abilities, occurs through a process that is mediated by another person, right? We learn how to self-regulate because another person who has the ability to self-regulate co-regulated with us, right? Helped us to learn how to self-regulate. For those of you who are parents, when your infant child is screaming and crying, they cannot self-regulate, right? You enter the room and what you intuitively do, and this is all pre-programmed in your genes, which is absolutely nuts, right? No one has to teach you how to do this. You pick up the baby, you hold it close to your body, right? Usually right around your heart, so it can feel your breath rate. and feel your heart rate. And it's interesting because the energy emits from your heart, you can measure it up to 3-5 feet away from somebody, right? So it's actually emanating out of your body and into the child, right? And you start to use a very calming and soothing voice, right? And you're cooing in their ear, and you start to rock them, right? And ironically, you're rocking them at a breath rate that would calm them down and a heart rate that would calm them down, right? And then they're learning to regulate through this regulating other, right? Now, if you're a parent and you're like, oh my God, last night I screamed at my kid, what the hell did I do? Don't worry, I did too. But actually, healthy self-regulatory ability is you have this, relationship and trust and a safe relationship with a co-regulating other, but then there's also periods of rupture and repair, right? There's periods where things go badly, and then there's this sort of joining together and mending of feelings, and both people sort of regaining their ability to regulate, right? And so, so this doesn't need to be a perfect process, but that is how we develop this capacity, and it frankly is what we need to offer dysregulated kids. We need to, one of the first things we need to do, we'll talk about in a minute, is offering them a co-regulating other. So as far as assessment and intervention goes, I mentioned Deb Dana and said nobody has done more to translate Stephen Porges' work for everyday people, particularly in the field of mental health, than Deb Dana, and that's still absolutely true. Nobody, at least as of 2 years ago, when she wrote her book, has done more to do that for people that work with kids than Mona Delhook, right? So she's a clinical psychologist down in Southern California who works with children and families. And because of that, has some experience in the school system too. So we'll reference her book here in a minute, and I think it's worth picking up and reading. And she talks about this, and because of, and we'll come back to this in a minute, she kind of describes them as different color pathways, right? Because to be honest with you, nobody needs to know ventral vagal, dorsal vagal, sympathetic. I mean, hopefully I didn't lose half of you when I said that earlier, right? Just sort of watching people to start dropping from the list of participants when I say that. But so she has these 3 color pathways, right? But they basically describe the things we talked about earlier, right? We feel calm and safe. We're in a state of physiological arousal and mobilization, where we're irritable and angry, possibly even rageful, or the blue state, where we start to withdraw, right, in states of extreme stress. Now, as far as assessment goes, right, like this comes from Mona Delhook, Dr. Delhook, and I think it's really super helpful because this would go, as far as assessment, like if you're an assessor, right, a school psychologist or psychologist, when you're doing an observation, right, maybe these are some things you're observing for, right, some of these physiological signs, right, not just kind of describing the behaviors and what's going on in the environment. But I think even more importantly, when we're working directly with kids, right, so when we're a counselor working with a young person who's dysregulated, or a teacher, connecting with somebody in their classroom that needs help, or psychologists providing some type of mental health services in school, our ability to quickly assess this on the fly, right? I'm kind of considering that as part of assessment too. But when we're in these different states, there's different physiological markers or signs of it. And part of that is because our vagus nerve is one of our 12 cranial nerves. So it sort of connects to the brain at the base of our skull, with nerves that innervate other areas, right? Including our ears and our larynx and our eyes, right? And so all these systems are all integrated with one another, right? So if somebody's in a state of engagement, their eyes are open, they're making good eye contact, right? They're able to hold direct eye contact with somebody else. Maybe their face is neutral, but it could be smiling, and they can move easily between them, right? They're not stuck in one type of facial expression, and their voice, they're able to modulate their voice, right? And express different tones and laugh. And their body, they've got good tone, and they're sitting upright, and their movements are coordinated, and their movements aren't too fast or too slow, right? And they're able to adjust the speed of their movements depending on what the demands are in that moment, right? But if you move into this red sort of sympathetic nervous system state, suddenly you're not making eye contact, right? Or your eye contact is really intense, right? Or you're rolling your eyes. I love my 5-year-old. He's got this little like dramatic eye roll. I think he does it for effect. I don't know. I'm not sure he's in a sympathetic state. But you start to see these changes in eye movement, right? Or their facial expression, their jaw is tense, and they're frowning or appear angry or in experiencing disgust, right? Their voice, right? They're loud, they're yelling, they have a sarcastic or hostile tone, and their body is tense, right? And moving oftentimes very quickly and unpredictably, and they may be hitting and kicking and throwing things and having sort of threatening gestures, right? They're in this sympathetic nervous system state, right? They're in a state of fight or flight. And for those who have sort of entered into this blue zone, right, this dorsal vagal shutdown state, they're oftentimes not making eye contact, right? Looking down or looking away, not wanting to make direct eye contact with people. Their facial expressions are blank or flat. Their voices has a very soft tone. Physically, perhaps sort of slumped over, and moving very slowly, right? When they're in this autonomic state, right? So we can see it in our kids, right? We can observe it in their behaviors and really have a pretty quick assessment in terms of where their autonomic nervous system is at. Now, when we're thinking about assessment, of course, this isn't in the moment, but when we're doing an assessment either formally, right, like they were referred for an evaluation, right, and we're doing an assessment, or really just in sort of understanding our kids, right, and what their needs are. Really going back and looking at their health and developmental history is really super important. I'll tell you what, when I entered into the field of education as a school psychologist, I really underappreciated the importance of a thorough health and developmental history. But any number of factors in a child's early prenatal or development as a young child can have a significant impact on their developmental trajectory. Right, so when there were complications during pregnancy or delivery that possibly put the child under high levels of stress. Maternal stress during the third trimester, it is associated with all sorts of problems, with the child. Any health challenges early in life, sleeping patterns and temperament. And when I talk about health challenges, again, something that, perhaps everybody sort of thinks like, oh, James, you never thought about that. And, well, I'm being honest with you, I didn't, right? If I were to go into surgery, right, and if we're even put under, right, so I'm not even awake during the surgery, my body is detecting the trauma, right? So my body knows it's being cut, right? It's aware of that, even though I am not conscious of it when it's happening. And there are people who experience PTSD following major surgeries, and think about, those are with adults, right? Think about a 9-month-old. Right? Without any clear understanding of the world, they're separated from their parent. They're in this loud room surrounded by people who they can't see their faces, and and their body undergoes significant trauma. That's real. We need to know that, and certainly any history of any other significant stressors. And your trauma is individual. Two people can experience the same event, and one person can experience it as traumatizing and another person not, right? So we really need to understand from the child's perspective, about these stressful events and how they experience them, and some of the challenges they're experiencing, like, do they correlate? I'm doing an assessment for a young child right now where, no problems in development, doing well in school. Guess what, right? All of the difficulties with attention and executive function and memory problems and behavior regulation and anxiety and all these things correlate with domestic violence from a stepfather that was abusive, right? Important things to understand, right? And so, here with the meds, I'm not going to go into these in great detail, although I think another really underappreciated area in our work in schools is the impact that sleep has on kids functioning. The majority of kids you're working with are chronically sleep deprived. And that contributes to anxiety and depression and attention problems and memory problems and poor behavior regulation and everything else. So sleep is a big one, but so is diet and exercise and time outdoors. And excessive media use is a personal interest of mine, but I'll move on. So, as far as the behavior tracking, sort of one more part of the assessment process here too. So we're looking at their development, where there's significant stressors in their history. We're looking at the physiological signs, of stress and autonomic nervous system functioning. And then when we're looking at behavior assessment, a lot of this is similar to what we do, right? Like, we want to know when the behavior occurs, what might have sort of triggered the behavior, how long does it last? I think another important question is, how long does it take for the child to fully recover? Right, and sort of re-enter and re-engage. I think that's another important thing. But things that we oftentimes don't think about, right, are physical and health factors, right? Is there hunger, constipation, diarrhea, illness, allergies, headaches, poor sleep that might be contributing? It's sort of covered up here, and I don't know if there's any occupational therapists in our group today, but really sort of, an appreciation for different, for sensory processing disorders and how, somebody's perhaps inability to effectively, filter out sensory stimuli may be very overwhelming to them as well too, is an important one to understand. And when thinking about triggering behaviors, right, triggering events, a lot of times it's not just what happened immediately before the behavior. It could be a culmination of events that happened long before we ever saw that child, right? And I think these are some of the pieces that are missing when we're looking at our behavioral assessments and we're thinking, God, I don't know why the behavior happened. There's no pattern, there's no rhyme or reason to it. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason for what we're observing in our immediate experience, but there may very well be a rhyme or reason for it, within that child's experience. Now, as far as the interventions go, so I'm going to walk through this a couple times here, each time with a little bit more detail, but Dr. Porges says safety is the treatment, right? When somebody is experiencing autonomic nervous system dysregulation, it's because their body is perceiving threat in their environment. Now, I want to be really clear, like you might be standing right next to them and not detecting any threat at all, right? Because you have a healthy functioning autonomic nervous system. Their body may be perceiving threat and they may not even be aware of it, right? I mean, this is all occurring outside of their awareness, right? But because they're experiencing threat, what they need is to feel safe, right? And that's the first thing that we need to do. In order to do that, we have to be well regulated, right? We can't be a co-regulating agent if we're not regulated ourselves. We have to be able to accurately assess what the child's autonomic nervous state is, so we're able to intervene appropriately. We're using our sort of therapeutic use of self or co-regulation to help them calm and relax. And we're really focusing on cues of safety and eventually after that, social engagement, and beyond that, relational joy, really sort of cultivating a trusting and loving relationship where the child feels safe in our presence. Now, to note, I think one of the problems is, and we don't really recognize it, is that behavioral interventions and cognitive interventions, if somebody isn't on the green pathway, they don't work, right? If somebody's in the red or blue pathway, language centers of their brain aren't online, right? So the more you talk to them, the more frustrating it becomes, right? And behavioral interventions, like giving them choices, frustrates the hell out of them, right? Because their executive functions have shut down and their decision-making ability has shut down. And so then they're saying, like, I don't really care what you're telling me right now, right? And they're still in this state. And the more that we do that, the more severe the behavior comes. And I think even in my opinion, even worse, right? We see a lot of autonomic nervous system dysregulation for kids on the spectrum. And I've been in classrooms where a kid with autism is clearly dysregulated and in a state of distress. And we're doing things like ignoring them. Because like, oh, if you ignore the behavior, you're not going to reinforce it and then the behavior will stop. Well, you're ignoring the person, right? You're not just ignoring the behavior. And if somebody's in a state of distress and what they need is cues of safety and social engagement, and we're ignoring them, that aggravates the behavior, right? And every time I've ever seen it, that's what's happened. And then so what we're doing then is we're modifying the environment to make sure that the child's experiencing a tolerable level of stress. Again, establishing a sense of safety and connection. And so, we have to be regulated ourselves. We're going to limit what we say because they're not processing language anyway. We're providing a comfortable emotional presence, right? So we're using a soft tone of voice. We are communicating through our body language and facial features that it is safe, right? And that we are not threatening. We're getting down to their level, right? So when I say stay low and move slow, because when you're standing above somebody, their body perceives it as threatening. And when you move quickly, their body perceives it as threatening. So we're really presenting ourselves to them as somebody who can be trusted and is safe. And then we're obviously, while we're doing that, assessing their autonomic state. As we see them calming down, based on all those physiological markers we talked about, we're able to move closer, we're able to talk more. Once they enter into a green pathway, then we can start talking about behavior choices. Then we can start talking about, sort of cognitive reframing or whatever the intervention that we're going to do, right? But it's not first until they're in that state. And so we need to help them get there, right? And so there's things that we can do, whether they're sensory strategies or breath work or a cool drink of water or getting outside or getting physical movement, things that will help either sort of increase arousal, right? Or decrease arousal, depending on whether or not they're on the red or blue pathway. And then of course, like I said, once they're in that state, then we can provide other types of interventions. Now, it's not just about responding in that moment, right? That's all great, when somebody's in a state of distress, but we don't want to constantly be intervening when they're in states of distress, right? We want to teach them how to regulate themselves. And Mona Delahook does a really nice job of this, and she talks about, teaching the different color pathways, not teaching the scientific language, right? None of that, right? But just talking about red and blue and green pathways and examples of the child when they're on those different pathways. So what it looks like from their personal experience, right? So they can really connect with it. And then talking about different strategies that they can then use when they're in those moments to help them to be able to self-regulate. And again, it's not to say one is good or bad, they're all helpful, right? But those states are sending us different information, right? So when I'm in a state of distress, my body's telling me like I'm alerted by something, right? When my body's in a sort of state of shutdown, my body's telling me like, oh, you need to kind of conserve energy right now. There's something really big that you're dealing with, and that's helpful information. We just need to know how to work with it. And then of course, using, she's a big promoter of the use of therapeutic play and creative art and movement and things like that with young kids, where now we're getting a chance to, practice, right? So we're either, creating art or theater and drama and acting out these different, autonomic states and our strategies and things like that. Now, again, it's on the next slide. So here's her book, right? Beyond Behavior. So I highly recommend that. And I don't know, I think I just recommend that to everybody. But Beyond Behavior is a wonderful resource if you're helping professional working with kids, or if you're a parent, right? Really helpful resource. I believe she's writing one. I think this book is applicable to both, but I believe she's working on a book that's just for parents that hopefully is coming out here pretty soon. And the ones on the right are just some of Deb Dana's work. That polyvagal flip chart is super cool. So if you're interested in learning more about the autonomic nervous system, and you're like, James, that sounded kind of cool, but you lost me like on slide 2, pick up Deb Dana's flip chart. It'll help. And both of them talk about like the use of play, and Dr. Porges does too. It's interesting because play is like kind of like this blend of like this sympathetic activation, right? This mobilization, this high energy. And then also this social engagement at the same time. And if you watch young kids play, you see this balance, right? So like kids will be like having a great time and they're like slamming into each other and laughing. And then suddenly like someone's crying and screaming and hitting, right? Because they're in the sympathetic state, it's just being like tempered by this social engagement, right? And it can easily tip in the wrong direction. But with that said, it's a great neural exercise, right? Like we're exercising this mobilized state, this high energy, high engagement, and learning how to regulate that through social engagement, right? So we're strengthening that capacity while we're doing it. And it's, you think about all the things involved in play, right? Around joy and attention and communication and theory of mind and perceiving what others might be thinking in that moment. But even all of the executive skills, right? Like there's a lot of cool research around developing executive skills in young children through play, right? Because we're taking on other people's roles, we're sort of organizing, social situations. There's a lot of, sort of working memory and managing pieces and looking at relationships between them and predicting outcomes, right? In the play, like if I do this, then this is going to happen next, and so like a lot of executive skills involved in that too. And, I'm not a play therapist. I mean, I'm a testing psychologist and I probably always will be. But here's a resource here for the Association of Play Therapy, if that's something that you are interested in learning a little bit. And there's other tools too, so, mindfulness is sort of like taken the world by storm in the last 5 years. If you haven't checked out mindful schools in, I think they're in Emeryville, a really great resource, a lot of wonderful training for educators and really advanced training, frankly, for people who are really want to get deep into their mindfulness practice. They got some pretty cool stuff going on there. It has been shown to help improve autonomic nervous system regulation, lowers cortisol stress levels, right? Contributes to the release of serotonin and dopamine and, hormones like GABA, DHEA, and things that sort of help us to feel good. The tricky thing for me with mindfulness I don't know what the hell's going on inside that kid's head. I don't know if they're doing it or not, which is kind of interesting, right? Because all these studies on mindfulness, we know we taught somebody something. We observed something, right? We don't know necessarily what was going on in that person's head, or if it was the same thing that was going on with all the other people in participating, right? So it's kind of a tricky one, when you think about, mindfulness there, and what the sort of the, I don't know what would be the word, the independent variable is, right, in a lot of those studies. I think personally, and it'd be kind of cool if schools went in this direction. The technology super cheap now is heart rate variability biofeedback. And that probably sounds super, super crazy. It's not as crazy as you think. There's very cheap devices, $120 from the Institute of Heart Math here that connect with your phone, right? And they're actually doing a lot of cool research and work with kids and kids programs and wanting to get this into schools. But I don't know what's going on inside a kid's head while they're doing mindfulness. Heart rate variability tells me exactly what's going on. Because heart rate variability, it's a speeding up and slowing down of our heart rate. They call it the interbeat intervals, right? It's the time lapse between the thump, right? Measures of that, which you can detect all sorts of ways. Right? You got a little clip on your finger, a little clip on your ear can detect it. It's actually one of the best markers of autonomic nervous system functioning that we have, right? And now you got ones that hook up to your smartphone. And what's even really cool about that is not only is it a measure of autonomic nervous system functioning, if you wear it long enough, right? You can actually train to improve your heart rate variability, and by extension, your autonomic tone, right? Your autonomic flexibility. And so we can actually detect it and teach it and measure the outcomes of it really pretty inexpensively. I mean, I think it's like mindfulness on steroids, right? It's like mindfulness with the kids, because a lot of the techniques are really similar, but we're actually gathering like the physiological data to know whether or not they're doing it or not, and whether or not they're improving. It's really pretty remarkable. So I don't know, that's just a little plug for heart math. But here, thank you. I don't know, thank you. We're at an hour, so that's our time. But a couple things here, the drjamesbylund.com. Hopefully that's the Bylund clinic here pretty soon and next month, but hopefully this one will still lead to the other one. The techhealthy.org, check that out in the fall. We're working hard to get it up and running, but I think it's going to be a really cool resource too for anybody that's working with kids and concerned about the amount and impact of their screen and media consumption. But anyhow, I can stop sharing my screen here, but thank you so much for sitting through all that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bylund. So I just wanted to remind everyone that now you can put questions in the chat and they can be answered by Dr. Bylund. I did want to, while everyone's typing their questions, I did want to say thank you so much for this presentation. I was wondering, what would an implementation in schools look like for polyvagal theory?
I'm sorry, say it again.
What would the implementation of this, what should that look like?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? I think it can be implemented on a lot of different levels, right? I think personally, I think anybody that's working with kids needs to understand the autonomic nervous system and how that's manifesting in the kids that they're working with. Because if we're not on the green pathway, right, we're not learning. When we're in a state of fight or flight or a state of shutdown, all of the higher level cognitive abilities that are required for learning and school performance are not online, right? So I think sort of understanding that one is key. Then with that understanding, depending on what your role is in schools, is how do we engage with kids, make sure that they feel safe and secure, build trusting relationships, and get kids truly engaged in school. If there's a kid that's dysregulated in class and frankly causing a lot of disruption, I get it, right? But sending them out of the room isn't doing anything to improve it. If a kid is shut down and they have their hood over their head and their head's on their desk and they're getting sent out of the classroom, right? Or they're not showing up to school and we're like, oh gosh, we're going to send them to the school attendance review board, right? And punish their parents for it, which, isn't going to work either, right? And so, whether you're a teacher trying to keep kids engaged in the classroom and building those trusting relationships, whether you're a helping professional like a school counselor or a school psychologist working with kids, for me as a testing psychologist, I think it's helpful for my assessment and understanding what's really going on here, right? And what kind of recommendations am I going to make if what I'm observing is autonomic nervous system dysregulation, not just bad behavior.
I see. Okay. Well, Thank you. I guess we have a quiet crowd today, but thank you so much, Dr. James Bylund, for coming to this talk, and thank you everyone here for showing up as well. We really appreciate you spending your time with us, and the purpose of this community is to try and keep you engaged in your learning. And so if you showed up here today, that you did that. So thank you for coming and doing that with us.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your interest in the topic, right? And it was obviously just a real quick view of it, but I hope at least some people here sparked enough interest to go learn more about it.
Yeah, exactly. If you haven't already, please make sure to join our next meetup. Our meetup group is called SF Area School Counselors and Education Professionals. And also our next meetup is going to be on May 12th with Sean Davenport. So thanks everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you guys.